You're listening to Arsenal for Democracy, episode 426, recorded on Sunday, May 15th, 2022. I'm your host, Bill Humphrey. Joining me on the line from Idaho, as always, is my co-host, Rachel. Hello, Rachel.
Hi, Bill.
This week's episode is part one of a multi-part, we're not sure if it's 2, 3 parts or whatever, on containerization, which is the process of converting global shipping to shipping containers. A shift that had a profound effect on global world trade, but also especially on downtown and inland river ports and the cities associated with them. On the other hand, it created some inland warehouse logistics jobs in places that never would have had them. The whole world economy gets reoriented around containerization. And the source that we'll be relying on for this one is a source that you may have heard of if you've heard anybody else's episodes on this topic or anything like that, or you've gone out and looked it up yourself. It's The Box, published in 2006 from Princeton University Press. The Box, How the Shipping Container Made the World Smaller and the World Economy Bigger by Mark Levinson. And again, this is kind of the definitive book on the topic, I think, that most people would say. And it's a relatively short book, but just so densely packed. In fact, I think, Rachel, you and I were talking about beforehand that you can get almost a note out of each paragraph if you want. So that's one reason, in fact, that we've had to split it up into multiple chapters. But I think you're going to get a real deep dive from the perspective that you've come to expect from Arsenal for Democracy on this particular topic. We'll hit the relevant angles you're expecting on not only the industrial history, but the way it relates to military history, the labor history aspects, and so forth. And we've obviously done episodes as well on various port issues, pre-containerization, post-containerization. We've talked about strikes in the 1930s. We've talked about a lockout in the immediate post-9/11 period. So with that, Rachel and I have sort of split up the book and kind of alternated chapters, not exactly every other chapter, but we divided up which chapters we were going to focus on because it was so rich in information. And there was just a ton of stuff that I had no idea about, and I feel like I've really opened my mind, and it's such a readable book, even though it is quite dense. And we're going to cover in part one the beginning of this period, basically the 1950s. 1956 is used as the benchmark year by Levinson because that was when the first quote-unquote modern container ship was launched. So we'll talk a little bit about things before that situation. Then we'll talk about the early years of containerization, and then we're going to go up through the Vietnam War period, which is immensely important to this story. And I didn't realize how important the story of containerization was to the Vietnam War as well. And once we get through that content, which is up through, I think, about chapter 9 of the book, that's going to have given everyone a really solid foundation for understanding the true revolution unleashed after that point from containerization. So you'll have all the basics in place to understand what's going to happen to the world economy, to the U.S. economy, to many local economies, and so forth. We're obviously, as always, going to focus more on the U.S. aspects than other potential things, that he talks about in the book, a lot of other countries and their experiences. This show focuses more on the U.S., so we're going to drill down on some of those. But that is the roadmap of where we're going with this examination of containerization. And it's just, again, a wonderful book. So you won't want to miss reading it yourselves if you can get your hands on a copy of it. But we did want to kind of go through and highlight the things that jumped out to us as being particularly important. And in many ways, a lot of this is excellent background to some of the topics that I have been covering and will be covering on the special sort of side project series that I've been doing on the 1970s. And because this is the thing that helps trigger a lot of the transformations in the economy that start in the 1970s and emerge quite rapidly, and how we get to the economy of the 80s and 90s from there. So with that, let's dive in. As I said, 1956, that's the benchmark year mentioned in Chapter 1 and throughout some of the other chapters, because the Ideal X was the ship that was launched that we can recognize as being, not some sort of a prototype necessarily, not obviously the final refined version of things, but the practical use case demonstration that was in service. So Levinson talks about in the intro chapter kind of the broad strokes of this topic of containerization. It rapidly destroyed the waterfront economies of any port without sufficient water depth for the new container ships and without sufficient space for the high-speed loader-unloader machines, which also required fewer workers and work hours, even in ports, that could serve them. Containerization also destroyed the local industrial economy of almost everywhere that had one, because now factories did not need to be proximate to customers or suppliers if they were just part of a chain. And regarding supply chains, one thing that I noticed while I was reading this and had been thinking about while doing the economic research for my series about the 1970s is that there is actually a pertinent overlap, not just a differentiation, between the concepts of outsourcing and offshoring. Sometimes people will correct a sort of blurry use of the terminology because technically outsourcing means contracting with an external provider to provide a service or component, whereas offshoring refers to moving factories and operations overseas within the company. But the overlap that containerization helps trigger, which probably accounts for the public blurring of the concept in, say, the 1980s and 1990s, if not beyond, is that sometimes companies decided not to offshore part of their production sequence, but instead to outsource that aspect of their supply chain to an entirely external company, which was already operating overseas. That's something that's covered more in chapter 14 toward the end of the book, so I'm providing this now as, again, part of a roadmap and overview here of where this is going and why this matters, but we're going to have to circle back to that, not in part 1. Probably one of the most visible and ubiquitous examples of what I'm talking about, though, today is that the Taiwanese tech firm Foxconn, founded in the 1970s, produces iPhones for Apple. The production is outsourced overseas rather than offshored within Apple, but overseas. A huge amount of transistor-based technologies that are relevant to the early third industrial revolution in places like Silicon Valley were built by third-party companies from East Asia on behalf of American or European companies designing, commissioning, marketing, and selling them. And the reason that I'm mentioning this now, even though we're not going to focus on it in today's part, is because I want you to start thinking about that timeline, the 1970s and so forth. This is what we're going to be building toward over the course of today, and you're going to see all those seeds getting planted, one by one in a trail that leads directly to the situation that we have today, emerging out of the 1970s as being inextricably linked with this. That does not happen without containerization, and we're going to get into exactly why that is. However, containerization, despite all of the revolutionary changes that it has brought, has not been applied evenly, even to present day. It is the prerequisite to a significant buildup of industrial production for export in developing nations. Prior to this, they would have only tended to export raw materials extracted or harvested domestically by necessity. After containerization, they could offer low-wage labor competitively without the very high shipping costs and time that cancel out the savings. And a key thing to understand here as well, and this is something we're going to keep looping back to periodically, is that the costs of the pre-containerization shipping and the time associated were so significant that even without rolling back trade tariffs and restrictions, containerization makes this transoceanic shipping suddenly very cost-effective to do, which is something that I had been struggling to really wrap my head around while working on the 70s series, because I'm thinking, well, this is all happening before the period of all the free trade deals that start in the late 1980s and throughout the 1990s and so forth, and a big part of that is containerization. So let's kind of talk about some of the basics of what the thing is itself. Containerization, container shipping, container ports. What is that? So the basics of that in terms of dimensions, statistics, a modern container port, which would be after the early period that we're about to talk about, has dozens of berths. One berth docks or unloads one container ship. These ships are up to 1,100 feet long and 140 feet across. The containers are 40 feet in length generally. They're stacked 15 to 20 across and 6 to 7 high on the deck, with 6 to 8 below in the holds. Cumulatively, this adds up to thousands of containers per ship. The tonnage is enormous, and the crew is often just 20 people. The 200-foot-tall port cranes move around on special rails on shore along the length of the ship, with an interim rubber-tired transporter that carries the container to and from temporary storage or staging areas for rail and truck transport in and out of the port facility. The boom swings out over the ship's entire width. The boom has a little trolley moving back and forth to precise locations to position a spreader that secures the container by 4 of its corners and lifts it up or down and then carries it to where it needs to end up. Loading or unloading one container takes 90 to 120 seconds, shifting 30 to 40 containers per hour. Generally, they're trying to simultaneously load and unload a ship with new containers going into the emptied sections progressively. Everything is extremely computerized and automated, something we talked about on our West Coast Ports lockout episode about the 2002 lockout. And the reason for that is they need to unload or load every container in a specific order to make sure the ship doesn't capsize from a weight balancing problem, especially since not every container holds equally heavy cargo. Levinson notes at this point that there can be problems when the reported contents do not correspond to the real contents, either through errors or intentional misrepresentation for illegal shipping. And the sheer volume of traffic through each port daily renders it impossible to inspect container contents, which has some distinct disadvantages, but obviously a lot of advantages for a lot of people. The illegal shipping being one example of that. So that kind of goes over the where this containerization process ends up. But it actually gets pretty close to that point by the 1960s, especially the mid to late 1960s. And as you can imagine, as we're talking about, that requires pretty significant capital to be invested in these ports. And that's a theme that we're going to keep coming back to over the course of this episode. It also requires a certain level of computerization to be available to be able to pull this off. And it is something that's not just a computerization that's nice to have or makes it speed up. It is essential to make sure that you don't have a load balancing problem with the ship. The Vietnam War, as we'll talk about, was also a major factor in the U.S. government endorsing and investing in containerization despite immense local labor and transportation company opposition. Levinson goes into the Vietnam War in a later chapter, so we'll be talking about that to close out part 1 today. Mid-century shipping costs, which is something Rachel is going to talk about in a moment, were so high that international or transoceanic trade was extremely minimal in the pre-containerization era. And that's something I also don't think I completely realized. And again, it's not just about having sort of protectionist trade policies and so forth. It's just that in general, it was so annoying, time-consuming, and expensive to ship things across the ocean that you tried not to do it if you could avoid it. You just tried to build a factory close to where you needed it to be. And that means that when containerization does happen, that's going to have profound effects, not only for international competition, but obviously for where factories are physically located, including within countries, not just across international boundaries. Today, however, the shipping costs, because of containerization, are so marginal per unit as to be almost ignored altogether. Containerization was adopted first for land-based shipping and then waterborne shipping. Logistically, it was easier to implement on land first, and the savings were more immediate with less capital investment required than container-capable intermodal seaports. The smooth and rapid transfers of containers dramatically shortened dwell times where cargo sat around in port warehouses or rail yards waiting to be moved somewhere else. This unlocked the cost savings of just-in-time shipping with all its attendant vulnerabilities, something that we will talk about not in part 1, but again, just giving you a roadmap of where this is all leading. Now, I want to quote specifically from the first chapter here. In the decade after the container first came into international use, in 1966, the volume of international trade in manufactured goods grew more than twice as fast as the volume of global manufacturing production, and 2.5 times as fast as global economic output. And I think that's important to kind of contextualize how significant of a change this is going to have on the world economy. Levinson also notes that one of the central contradictions of containerization is that it forces a huge downward pressure on consumer retail goods prices, which keeps the public happy, but it also destroys the domestic economic base that is employing that public, which makes them very unhappy. Let's move on now to Chapter 2, so Rachel can provide us with some additional context of the pre-containerization dock system and the concept of break bulk cargo as opposed to container cargo.
Yeah, so prior to containerization, loading and unloading freight was a labor and time intensive process. Each item, whether it was a wooden crate or a steel drum or bale of cotton or even paperboard cartons were used to move items. Each item had to be carefully transferred from the dock into the hold of the ship. So packing a hold was a very skilled job. Packing these disparate items was very tricky. If you packed these items too loosely, they could cause damage and by moving and colliding in rough waters. And like Bill mentioned earlier, the balance was issue was a very important one. If you loaded the cargo with a weight imbalance, the ship could capsize. So obviously, it was a very highly skilled job. You had to know what you were doing when you were packing items into a hold. And packing also depended on which items would be unloaded at each port. You wouldn't want to pack the items to be unloaded at the next port buried under 100-kilo bags of sugar that took 2 men to move that was going to the final port. So you had to have an awareness of what you were packing and the order that they would need to be unloaded later. So as a result, ships often stayed a week at each port while ships were being unloaded and reloaded. And each day that a ship wasn't actively transporting freight added to the cost of shipping. Um, Quoting from the book, in 1959, it was reported that 60 to 75% of the cost of transporting cargo by sea is accounted for by what takes place while the ship is at the dock and not by steaming time. So there was obviously a huge problem um, with this slow process. The costs were just very enormous, and that's why it shipping by sea wasn't very popular at this time, as Bill mentioned earlier. Inventory was also a very arduous process. Each item had to be unloaded from the trucks or trains parked at the dock um, that were bringing goods to the dock, and each item had to be unloaded one at a time and recorded on a tally sheet before it could be moved into transit sheds, which are warehouses where items were held before being loaded onto the ships. When the ships were loaded, each item had to be counted again before going on the ship. So, a huge process, hard to control, hard to keep track of each item. So, theft was kind of rampant at this time, just because the inventory process was there were so many moving parts. And one note that was highlighted in this chapter, the immediate post-war shipping environment was dominated by thousands of America's retired, cheaply built Liberty ships and Victory ships that were intentionally built small during the war to minimize the amount of cargo lost per sinking by enemy submarines, ships, and planes during dangerous convoy runs. In civilian use, they were numerous, slow, and inefficient in terms of cargo volume, but they were inexpensive to buy from the government, and they didn't require major capital investments on shore to load or unload them, however slow and labor intensive that might have been. Another aspect is the labor demand. The demand for dock workers was highly irregular depending on how many ships were docked and what they were carrying. For example, highly perishable cargo needed a lot of labor one day to quickly move it, and then the next there might be no work available. So this created a lot of competition amongst longshoremen. Each day, men would show up at the docks first thing in the morning, vying for a job that day. And then once they were hired for the day, they had to wait for the ship to come in. It might not even come in till 9 that night. And this time waiting was unpaid, but men would lose their spot if they left. So this setup created a lot of corruption. Men would bribe pier foremen to ensure that they were on the list of favorite workers. Um, Quoting from the book, in New Orleans, a weekly payoff of $2 or $3 was the norm to secure work the following week. Another form of corruption was borrowing money from peer foremen who had a side business of money lending. By taking a loan with a 25% interest rate, men were guaranteed a job so they could repay their loans, which were often taken out of their wages. This created a really competitive system, and to fight back against that, labor unions and government agencies both fought against this system. One notable episode that we did previously was episode 344 on the 1934 West Coast longshoremen strike. So on the West Coast, there was a highly organized, highly militant labor union that protected the interests of the workers and kept hiring more fair. So after the strike on the US West Coast, the order of hiring was determined by the public drawing of longshoremen's badge numbers in union-controlled hiring halls. In Australia and Britain, government-run labor boards took over work assignments, took the work assignments away from the peer foreman to reduce this corruption. In Rotterdam, strikes in 1945 and 1946 made it so that employers hired full-time staff rather than casual laborers. And on the east coast of the U.S., the Waterfront Commission of New York Harbor, created by New York and New Jersey, controlled hiring in the Port of New York starting in 1953. So there was a combination of labor unions and government agencies that were both fighting against this corruption. Like I mentioned earlier, another major problem in shipping was theft. Longshoremen justified theft as a response to poor economic and working conditions, but it was rampant everywhere, even where union contracts ensured good wages. For example, in Portland, Oregon, transistor radios and bottled liquor were stolen for family and friends, but they weren't typically resold. In New York, anything and everything was fair game. Even 60-kilo bags of coffee beans were stolen, and there were no qualms about reselling versus just giving away goods to family and friends. It was just everyone for himself, basically. So the solution to these high costs of transporting goods in a piecemeal fashion was clear. Put the freight in big boxes and move the boxes from point A to point B. But there were some obstacles to this plan. One big obstacle was the way rail shipping rates were determined. The Interstate Commerce Commission, or the ICC, regulated shipping rates, and they required that each commodity had its own rate, subject to ICC approval. So railroads had a hard time filling shipping containers with only one commodity and sought approval for weight-based shipping rates, regardless of what was in the shipping containers. Quoting from the book, "After 4 months of hearings in 1931, the Commission ruled weight-based rates illegal. Although it found the container to be a commendable piece of equipment, the Commission said that the railroads could not charge less to carry a container than to carry the equivalent weight of the most expensive commodity inside the container. With that ruling, containers no longer made economic sense on the rails." Starting in the 1920s, with the rise of truck transportation, they were kind of able to quickly come fill in that transportation gap, and trucks quickly became a practical alternative to rail, especially for short distance trips. This is prior to the interstate system, so trucks moving long haul trips just wasn't as practical of an alternative to rail, more for the short distance trips. Another big obstacle to containerization is the fact that early containers didn't actually confer many advantages over loose freight. Containers were often packed alongside loose cargo and took up valuable space. Many European containers had no tops, so they couldn't be stacked. You would just kind of pile your goods into a box and then throw a tarp over the top. So there wasn't really an advantage versus loose freight. There were no weight limits, so lifting a box could be a dangerous proposition, and many boxes had metal eyes on the top of each corner, which meant that longshoremen had to climb the boxes to attach hooks for lifting, which was also a danger to workers. Docks weren't made to accommodate boxes, which made loading tricky, and ships also weren't made to accommodate containers, leaving workers maneuvering against built-in posts and ladders in the holds of ships. When boxes were emptied of their cargo, oftentimes they were shipped back empty, which added costs to shippers compared to loose freight. However, the concept was promising, provided that the industry made great changes. And the last sentence of this chapter kind of lays out the scene. The solution came from an outsider who had no experience with ships. It was actually a trucking magnate named Malcolm McLean who helped to revolutionize the shipping industry. Throughout the 1930s and 40s, McLean created a trucking empire in the southeast U.S. at a time when railway freight was stagnating. However, he also ran into the limitations of the ICC. The Motor Carrier Act of 1935 brought interstate trucking under the authority of the ICC. The ICC controlled what commodities a trucking company could haul, the routes they took, and the rates they could charge. Any additional route or commodity that a trucking company wanted to take on required ICC approval. Major changes required hearings where other trucking companies or railroads could object. This made trucking inefficient. A truck would often have to drive home empty if there weren't any approved goods that he could move on the back trip. McLean had to find ways around these regulations. So he purchased carriers and adopted their routes. If he couldn't buy a new company, he leased them. So through these buyouts and leases, he expanded his network from Atlanta to Boston. And McLean was obsessive about cost cutting. He opened one of the earliest automated terminals in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and he used conveyors to transfer freight from one truck to another, which cut down on labor costs. He put diesel engines in his trucks at a time when most trucking companies use gasoline engines. He arranged corporate discounts at fueling stations along his routes and had his drivers only refuel at those stations. Realizing that safe drivers save the company money in insurance and repair bills, McLean created a robust driver training program, and he created incentives for the trainers. The senior driver got a bonus of 1 month's pay if a man he had trained made it through his first year without an accident. So he had a laser focus on finding ways to save money and cutting costs. And throughout the 1930s and 40s, highway traffic became more congested, and so McLean looked to war surplus cargo ships as a way to save money. Why not just put truck trailers on ships that could ferry them up and down the coast? However, the ICC also controlled domestic ship rates, which were well below rail and truck rates to compensate for slower service, which could save McLean money on moving cargo between North Carolina and the Northeast. McLean started looking for dockside real estate for McLean Trucking's first waterfront terminal. His timing was excellent, as the Port of New York Authority was looking to drum up business in Newark, New Jersey. The port at Newark had plenty of space for trucks and access to the New Jersey Turnpike, making it an attractive prospect for McLean. Quoting from the book, "Even better from McLean's point of view, the Port Authority had the power to issue revenue bonds. It could build the terminal and lease it to McLean Trucking, reducing the need for the company to raise funds. So not only would he save money on shipping his goods, he could get the Port Authority to fix up the terminal for him. So huge savings there. So while the Port Authority was working on renovating McLean's terminal in Newark, McLean had to buy a ship company. He set his sights on Pan Atlantic Steamship Corporation, which operated 4 ships along the coast between Boston and Houston. Pan Atlantic's business had been hurt by the longshore strike of 1954 in New York, but it owned the operating rights to serve 16 ports. Its parent company, Waterman Steamship, had 37 ships and $20 million in cash. McLean found that Waterman could be bought for $42 million. However, McLean had to get around ICC regulations that required them to approve the sale. So to do this, McLean kind of conceived of a pretty ingenious plan. He created a new company, McLean Industries, in January 1955. McLean, his brother, and his sister, who were also operators in McLean Trucking, put their controlling shares of McLean Trucking in a trust. Malcolm kept $5 million of stock, but the trustees were authorized to sell the rest. Once the trustees were put in place, the McLean family resigned their roles in McLean Trucking, and immediately afterward, McLean Industries bought Pan Atlantic. Although the ICC didn't approve of this transaction and their tactics, the McLeans didn't violate any laws. And later, using similar switcheroo tactics, McLean Industries took over the Waterman Board of Trustees and orchestrated the purchase of Waterman. And he basically scooped it because there was another shipping company that was sniffing around Waterman Corporation and wanted to buy them out. So he just had to get it done as quickly as possible. And in the book, it mentioned that this is the first example of a leveraged buyout. So it's pretty impressive. McLean was kind of a business genius and figured out all these ways to save money and move into this new industry. So once McLean took over Pan Atlantic, he started brainstorming ways to get truck trailers on ships. At first, he thought of backing trailers onto ships, then unhooking them from the engines, but the wheels of the trailers would take up too much precious cargo space. Then he thought of trailer bodies that could be lifted from the chassis and then carried to the ship. However, these bodies were just not commercially available for purchase, so he had to design them. And he hired Keith Tantlinger, an engineer with a reputation as a container expert, to design this trailer body of his vision. The containers had to be stackable and able to be locked into frames installed on the decks of his tankers. Tantlinger came through and designed 33-foot-long containers, much larger than any shipping container that existed at the time. Tantlinger also designed a way to lift the boxes with a crane to load them on the ship. A spreader bar that engaged hooks at the corners of each container with the flip of a switch. Once the box had been lifted and put in place, the hooks would disengage and the crane could then lift the next container. This eliminated the need of longshoremen to climb the containers and attach the hooks. Even after the technology was figured out, McLean had to wait for the bureaucratic obstacles to be ironed out. After months of hearings, the ICC overruled objections from the railroads and authorized Pan Atlantic to carry containers between Newark and Houston. Also, the Coast Guard had to approve of a test run to prove seaworthiness. They were really afraid that this moving containers on these tankers would just cause them to capsize or just be so unstable that it wouldn't be viable. So they had to be convinced. Finally, on April 26, 1956, at Port Newark, a crane placed a container on the Ideal X every 7 minutes. The ship was loaded in less than 8 hours compared to the pre-containerization days, where loading a ship could take up to a week. And the ship was loaded in less than 8 hours and set sail the same day. McLean and his executives flew to Houston to watch its arrival. The concept worked, and furthermore, the cost savings were monumental. Quoting from the book, loading loose cargo on a medium-sized cargo ship cost $5.83 per ton in 1956. McLean's experts pegged the cost of loading the Ideal X at 15.8 cents per ton. So a huge, huge amount of savings and cost cutting there. So the concept obviously worked and it was a viable option. So Bill's going to talk about the expansion of containerization starting in the mid to late 1950s.
Yeah, so Chapter 4 focuses on two specific companies and their work around the same time on this. McLean, his company later gets renamed Sealand, which you might recognize if you've seen containers from container ships before. That's a common brand name that you'll see on the side of a container. So Sealand is going to be with us for the rest of our narrative across however many parts this is. But they were focused on prototype work on the East Coast in the mid to late 1950s. And of course, this derives from this work that Rachel has just described, starting in around 1956. And the other company is Matson. That was a much older sort of legacy company based mostly, or at least focused mostly on the trade in Hawaii, between the Hawaiian Islands and back to the mainland over quite a distance. And Matson was also heavily focused on punch card computer research within shipping companies to figure out economic optimizations for the whole process of shipping things. And they end up also getting into the container game as well. So I don't want to get too bogged down in the various prototypes here. Rachel will address some of the standardization issues in a later chapter. I would encourage folks to read the book to get more on that. But there are a few things from this chapter that are worth highlighting from our perspective. So one observation that I wanted to make, we've talked a lot about the sort of huge capital that's required to convert a port to be able to handle these new containers, even if you set aside all the other sort of political and labor objections and so forth. And the result of this fact is that early container ports, so-called, often actually began, and we're talking really early ones like, late 1950s, they often began as just one or two privately owned piers. We did mention that the situation was a little bit different in Newark, across from New York as part of the overall Port of New York complex. We're going to come back to that in a few minutes. But while that was a publicly funded, financed port that would then lease you space, in many cases, these early container ports, which were kind of experimental or prototypical anyway, were privately owned, small ones that one company would be kind of fiddling around with and testing. With their, to figure out how to make containers work. They needed not only to convert or build specialized ships, but they also had to have specialized loading and unloading equipment on both ends. And of course, you didn't want to have to deal with the labor issues. So this is another factor in why some of these major container ports emerge out of really obscure places, is because you'd go to some place that didn't really have a significant port yet, and you'd set up a little one that was privately funded, and you'd kind of fiddle around with figuring out how to make it work, and you weren't really displacing any, much in the way of existing traffic, and that would give the companies some breathing room to figure this out. And again, for the most part, we're talking here about McLean, later Sealand, as well as Matson, as the companies that we're generally referring to in this section. Early tests of ship-based cranes rather than land-based cranes showed that the weight and balance factors simply did not work for ship-based cranes. And again, this significantly adds to this capital problem and the infrastructure problem. No existing port was going to convert all its operations to something experimental like these new cranes for containers, because containers were initially a very small share of arriving traffic. Therefore, it made sense for a company to invest themselves in upgrading a small pier just for themselves and their specific container needs. These conversions of ships and facilities were multi-million-dollar investments in money of the time, as opposed to money today, so these are even bigger in real dollars at the time. And Sealand, for example, took 6 years to become profitable. Focusing on minor ports for upgrades also had the advantages of being received gratefully by local workers and political leaders compared to the hostility at existing major ports. In ports where the port's owner, public or private, was willing to put up the investment money to upgrade to container infrastructure rather than the ship company having to do it themselves, the container ship company would instead pay rent to use the berths, which was still expensive, but it was not as expensive as investing money directly into upgrades. Switching over to Matson in 1958, so again, this is 2 years after the voyage of the Ideal X. Matson was the first shipping company to use a computer. They did this by renting time on an IBM mainframe, and they actually originally did it to just run simulation calculations, trying to figure out how to restructure their operations, which they were hoping were going to soon feature containers, so that they could maximize revenues and reduce costs. Actual computerization of the container record keeping and loading unloading methodology that we talked about in the beginning did not actually begin until 1965, so a lot of this was still experimental, but I think that's not a coincidence, right? You got to get to a certain level of computer availability and density to make a lot of this really take off. And 1965 is a good year to keep in your mind as well when we get back to talking about Vietnam at the end of this part. Most container experiments were conducted on quote-unquote domestic American routes. Rachel mentioned about the trips between Newark and Houston. That's a mainland run on both ends, but also specifically mainland runs to U.S. island territories on the Caribbean side, or to the state of Hawaii, or to the other Pacific territories. And again, McLean at the beginning mostly on the East Coast, whereas Matson's mostly on the West Coast. They later did more of these coastal runs, like the one that Rachel talked about, along the mainland coasts, which competed directly with the overland service. But again, that had a lot of problems associated with it, especially from a regulatory standpoint. So it was often, again, easier to do these experiments on these runs between the mainland and one of these island territories or the state of Hawaii. Puerto Rico specifically was embarking on an industrial development program at the time, which meant that they would, for the first time, have something to ship back to the U.S. mainland. And this made it a proving ground as well for the kind of offshore supply chain outsourcing that we'll talk more about later, not on this week's episode. In 1962, the first quote-unquote coast-to-coast, i.e. Atlantic coast to Pacific coast or vice versa via the Panama Canal, container service began. That was, at this point, about 6 years, again, after that first voyage. And we mentioned that Sealand took 6 years to become profitable. At the time, there was actually not that much competition in general between the West Coast and the East Coast of the United States, because it was so expensive to ship that way when we're talking about ships. So this was another way of proving that the containerization technology could be competitive with road and rail and provide various other advantages compared to traditional shipping methods. Almost from day one, of course, there was significant resistance among longshoremen to loading or unloading container ships. But it was also not consistent resistance either, and that's something we'll talk more about. Rachel, could you talk a little bit more now about the Port of New York versus the so-called Port Authority, which would later be specifically named the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey? These were technically two different entities, but basically operating and competing within the same space. And these were both public entities, but they had sort of different approaches to this with pretty profound impacts on the city and the region as a whole.
Yeah, so this is a pretty important chapter for East Coast shipping. Over the course of the 1950s, Port Elizabeth on the New Jersey side was a brand new quote unquote redevelopment of a marshland. That's harder to imagine from today's vantage point. South of Port Newark, which was an oil and lumber commodity focused port, and across from the traditional cargo piers of the New York City boroughs. The construction of Port Elizabeth as an adjunct to Newark was financed by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, specifically to support the future of shipping, i.e., intermodal, roll on, roll off truck trailers, and container shipping. This is exactly the kind of situation repeated all over the world as containerization took off. Legacy ports nearby get completely left behind in favor of brand new facilities in places that were hinterlands. Meanwhile, New York City's government, as opposed to the Interstate Port Authority, went all in on enormously costly redevelopment of the traditional cargo port facilities on the New York side in a historically doomed maneuver motivated by local politics and a desperate attempt to keep the economic center of gravity on the New York side, despite all the geographical and transportation obstacles, even before containerization. At least as early as 1959, city planners opposed to the waterfront port renovations were trying to make the case that the only sensible use of public investment in planning would be to obliterate the port before it died anyway, and to turn it into more upscale land uses. This is, of course, eventually what happened anyway, no surprise, given that new container traffic out of the Newark side exploded by leaps and bounds from 1956 to 1960, but not for many decades. Even the ILA, or the International Longshoremen's Association, by 1964 was conceding that maybe pier renovation projects should be mixed use and including housing projects, but by then it was too late and no one took them up on it. Private finance was eagerly already eyeing the waterfronts of Manhattan and Brooklyn for alternative uses, and by 1966 the city was already starting to hand off some of the waterfront to the Parks Department. Port Elizabeth was begun before modern containers started in 1956, but took a while to be built, as it required a lot of dredging and filling, and then waiting for it all to settle. And by the time it was in the home stretch in 1961, the final details could be fine-tuned to support container facility designs that literally had not existed when the forward-looking project was envisioned and broke ground. After that, Port Elizabeth was almost continuously expanded over and over to support more container traffic every year. By 1970, the New York side was functionally dead, except for passenger traffic, and localized unemployment was astronomical. Meanwhile, over in New Jersey, the container expansion was so fast and so massive that even with all its reductions in labor compared to units of cargo, there were still frequent labor shortages. The collapse in direct employment on the docks and nearby warehouses was closely followed by a collapse in New York City's urban industrial base as containerization and expressway trucking both began moving production supply chains away from a proximity-oriented model. A significant segment of the population soon exited as well. And the next chapter really focuses on the labor aspect and talks about the respective East and West Coast longshoremen unions' response to mechanization and automation. So the East Coast and West Coast had very different labor union outlays. On the East Coast, it was controlled by the ILA, which was very chaotically organized and localized along each East Coast port separately, with powerful local bosses and weak senior leaders and weak members. Another thing is that the locals were fractured along ethnic lines. Italian local bosses often fought with Irish national leadership and accused them of not really looking out for their interests. So the ILA saw the writing on the wall to a certain extent, and they tried to negotiate the employer's right to automate in return for protecting longshoremen's incomes, funded by a per-ton royalty. And the way they negotiated this was $1 per ton for each container on a container ship, 70 cents per ton for each container on ships designed for both containers and mixed freight, and 35 cents per ton for containers being carried on conventional break bulk ships. And this royalty was to be paid into a fund. However, ILA President Teddy Gleason, who was the union representative who worked on the negotiations, worried that this agreement hurt the union because there were no directives on how the fund should be spent, and the fact that the term container was never defined in the agreement, which was an omission that could cause union management conflict down the line. And anyway, even though this agreement was hashed out, the royalties never really materialized due to a sharp drop in cargo volume, especially in New York City, and militant ILA locals fought with more conciliatory locals. So they couldn't really come to a union-wide agreement on anything, and locals kind of dropped out of agreements or just wouldn't sign on to agreements. And this lack of unification meant that containerization happened in a really patchwork fashion, and the militant locals often got left behind as the world advanced around them. Mechanization, automation happened despite their protests and their best efforts. On the West Coast, they were controlled by the International Longshoremen's Workers Union, and they were very unified along the entire coast, and they also had a very strong rank and file. We talked about the ILWU in our episode about the 1934 West Coast strike. They were very unified. They were able to organize the entire West Coast. And so that power continued on into the 1950s and the 1960s. There is a lot of really good stuff in this chapter on leader and Australian-born radical Harry Bridges, and I think there's enough that would make for its own separate episode at some point, but today we'll stick more narrowly with a specific role he played in the debate over containerization. The West Coast ports had been in decline for decades when containerization and port mechanization started, which was not the case for the East Coast ports. Containerization was a big boost to the West Coast overall, albeit with some specific ports as casualties, in contrast to the general seaboard-wide devastation the East Coast ports experienced. The big missed opportunity here, also missed elsewhere but perhaps slightly more recognized on the West Coast at the time, was that containerization was going to create so much new shipping business overall that it would actually grow and stabilize employment, and could have made those jobs vastly higher paid from the tens of millions in new profits. But when automation was just seen as a marginal technological innovation on an existing process, with no change to the fundamentals of the entire maritime trade sector, it was instead envisioned as a threat to existing employment. Initial contract negotiations thus focused on the wrong angles. As in New Jersey, the West Coast ports very rapidly experienced labor shortages, not labor surpluses. But the union had kind of negotiated badly, misunderstanding the situation, and many of the ship companies weren't actually mechanizing yet, which was the whole focus of negotiating to modernize port work, but were instead simply taking advantage of union concessions on men and hours per cargo to demand more of each worker physically, which isn't what the union had in mind. The union then had to pivot to demanding mechanization to lighten these physical workloads after years of resisting mechanization fanatically. Suddenly, they were demanding arbitrators award machines in the workplace and insisting on capital investments in the ports, under the talking point from Harry Bridges. The days of sweating on these jobs should be gone. And by the mid-1960s, they were starting to achieve these new goals. But they really missed a step in those initial negotiations, and they couldn't take advantage of the increase in cargo volume that came about as a result of containerization. Another big labor dispute was jurisdiction on both coasts with Teamsters as these supply chains evolved. Off-dock loading work was traditionally done by Teamsters, and they saw the longshoremen as butting in on their turf, and so they took the unions to court, and the courts actually settled in the Teamsters' favor, so striking another blow to the longshoremen unions. Another sticking point, union representation of office workers whose computers controlled container operations would be a source of dispute for decades. So instead of kind of creating a united front of these office workers, there were kind of these battles over jurisdiction, and as a result, the union was kind of weakened over the decades by this mechanization automation process. Moving on to the next chapter, it's kind of a wonky chapter. It's about the standardization process. But it illustrates the long and arduous process of creating industry standards. I'm not really going to go into a lot of like the dimensions and the hard statistics. I don't want to just throw a bunch of numbers at you, but I really wanted to illustrate how long the process of standardization is. It was a really important step because it ensured the interoperability of containers, no matter the country or company that was handling them. Without standardization, containers could be waiting at port, while ships that couldn't handle them left without them. And also, docks and cranes for one ship line couldn't handle another line's containers, which also added inefficiency and higher costs to shipping. So standardization was necessary for the success of this containerization project. So some of the players in the standardization process. The first one that really got into the discussion was the United States Maritime Administration, or MARAD. They started the process in 1958. They were a government agency that had immense power over the maritime industry, and they, along with the Federal Maritime Board, dispensed subsidies to build ships. So they had the power to withhold subsidies to shippers that didn't adopt standard containers. MARAD named two committees of experts, one to recommend standard container sizes, and the other to study container construction and the materials that the containers were made out of. However, not included in these initial meetings were the existing containerized ship lines, so Matson and Sealand. They had already optimized sizes for their routes and biggest cargo, so asking them to adopt different standards would be a hardship for them, but they were kind of left out of the process. Another player in the standardization process, the American Standards Association, which was supported by private industry. They were also trying to establish standards. So the ASA created Materials Handling Sectional Committee 5, or MH5, in 1958, the same year that MARAD started their process. The MH5 tried to get MARAD to let private industry handle the standardization process, but MARAD continued to stay in the game. They refused to leave. In contrast to MARAD, which dealt with maritime business only, MH5 included trailer manufacturers, truck lines, and railroads. And despite their different interest groups involved, MARAD was able to agree with MH5's container sizes, so they kind of were able to reach an accord. However, yet another player, the National Defense Transportation Association, which represented companies that handled military cargo, also entered the fray. And they created a different set of standard sizes that didn't accord with MH5 and MARAD's standards, and that ended up being a problem in the mid-1960s during the Vietnam War, which we will get to soon. So with two sets of standards in play, behind-the-scenes wheeling and dealing began at the American Standards Association, trying to make sure that their standards were the ones that would get adopted industry-wide. Finally, on April 14, 1961, a quote-unquote family of approved sizes were approved. All containers were to be 8 feet wide and 8 feet tall, and the lengths could be 10, 20, 30, or 40 feet long. And the Federal Maritime Board announced that only container ships that were designed for those sizes could receive construction subsidies. So the standards were kind of tightening up at this time, really solidifying. And after this, the International Standards Organization, or ISO, got involved. At that time, only small containers were being used for shipping international freight, but that was obviously about to change as container shipping was adopted and used more widely. ISO standards would establish worldwide guidelines before firms made large financial commitments, so they wanted to create these standards before there was a lot of capital investment. Simultaneously, ASA was still working on domestic standards with the hope that ISO would later adopt them. ISO adopted the American standards as well as two smaller boxes that were 5 feet and 6 2/3 feet long, kind of a concession to the smaller European containers. Another part of this standardization process that took a lot of time was the design of corner fittings that were used to lift the boxes. As we said before, there were spreader bars that fit into these corner fittings that helped lift the boxes. And different ship lines had different fittings that they used to lift their boxes. Standardization would mean that every crane would be able to lift a box that conformed to standards, no matter the origin. The debate raged on until September 16, 1965, when a standard design was adopted by MH5 and later by ISO on September 24th. It's probably not a coincidence, as we will discuss soon, that the timing lines up with a key decision point in the Vietnam War. Despite agreeing on a standard design, they didn't adopt performance standards for the corner fittings. After a series of tests in 1966, engineers found that the fittings failed under heavy loads. There was a mad scramble to modify the corner fittings, and engineers determined that thicker steel in the walls of each fitting would fix the performance problems. This quote-unquote ad hoc design was adopted in June 1967, and thousands of boxes that had the 1965 fitting had to have new fittings welded into place, which was a pretty significant cost at the time. And as I mentioned before, Matson and Sealand were completely outside this process, and they got worried about missing out on subsidies that companies later to the game could take advantage of. So they lobbied Congress, and they were able to carve out an exemption to the Federal Maritime Board policy, so they wouldn't be punished for being early adopters and having non-conforming containers. Finally, in 1970, the ISO was ready to publish the first full draft of shipping container standards, ending a process that spanned well over a decade and included 37 countries and a lot of industry players. So international container shipping could now become a reality.
Well, before we get to 1970, we need to talk a little bit more about some other significant factors that happened in the 1960s that get us to that point in the 1970s where things really start to get going worldwide. Chapter 8 is essentially the takeoff of these container ship companies. This is a chapter mostly about corporate mergers and acquisitions in the 1960s, as well as regulatory reforms to account for the new economics of container shipping as opposed to mixed commodity goods shipping. This is an important prerequisite for being able to put this together. And of course, on this show, we sometimes like to talk about mergers and acquisitions as a way of illustrating certain developmental phases of various industrial revolutions and sub-eras of that. So one thing that we've talked about so far a little bit, but haven't really emphasized, is this point that initially the idea behind container shipping was that this was just going to essentially be a little bit of a tweak or a little bit of an innovation on the existing system, right? Not only did the companies think this, but also the unions, when they were negotiating, thought this. It was just, oh, this is going to be a little bit more efficient and so forth. But it's not going to fundamentally alter how manufacturing companies do their business, where operations are located. It's not going to, completely boost the amount of cargo being shipped internationally. And in reality, the ease and savings associated with this mean that other companies start first reorganizing their business around this new container model to basically maximize the efficiency and get the most out of it, but then to start totally restructuring their companies to take advantage of certain things that containerization suddenly unlocks for them. So container cargo evolved initially from a system that was closer to the status quo. Basically, you would pack the containers with a mixed cargo inside the container that happened to be going to the same port, and then you'd put it in the ship, as we talked about initially, that had other types of cargo. Then you start getting into more dedicated container ships, but you're still having these mixed contents containers. And that's not really the ideal to get the most out of this system. It still required a time-consuming, expensive, and potentially multi-union aggravating packing and unpacking operation near or in ports on both ends of a ship's trip. The big jump forward comes from the realization that the big savings would be non-mixed bulk cargo from a single source to a single destination, requiring no unpacking or reloading at any point in between. And of course, this is when the Teamsters get upset when they realize that's what's going to happen. Sometimes, for a company that's shipping a good from point A to point B, taking advantage of this means less frequent shipments or lighter shipments. But eventually it also meant small batch production in bursts. Now that's not something we're going to talk about today, but it is going to be something to keep in your mind when we come back in another part to talk about just-in-time shipping and the impact that that reality has. Right? You think about it, it's harder for a factory in the United States, a big second industrial revolution style factory, to just turn on production and then turn off production when they have enough widgets to fill up a container box. That's not really a viable model, but it might be a viable model if you start putting it in another country and rethinking how your sort of labor force in your factory are organized. But before you get to that point, again, typically the way that companies would handle this challenge was by sort of stockpiling for a bit. And you'd say, okay, we have enough to fill up a container, and now we'll ship it out, instead of previously just sort of continuously streaming out a supply of widgets to your customers and so forth. So that means that companies that are shipping goods and services have to start reorganizing how they do business around this new model. So at any rate, this development in the use of containers was only made possible by truck and rail container infrastructure to move the containers to and from the ports on either end without that unpacking or packing phase nearby. Trucks especially had already proven the light or partial load model was potentially viable because they had used it to poach business from railroads in the interwar and immediate post-war period. So that's a model where instead of waiting until you have an entire container's worth of stuff, you just say, we'll just send out half a container, but it's all the same thing, and then we don't have to worry about any of the unpacking or whatever. It's all going to the same destination, and it's got the same contents. The big railroads had countered this trend by the trucking companies by experimenting with intermodal piggyback freight service, wherein a truck would be put directly onto a long-distance train and moved across part or all of the United States, and then complete that last little journey locally by truck, now that local railroad service had mostly been outcompeted already by trucks. Piggyback experiments were happening around the same time or just before shipping container experiments, but they faced similar problems like lack of equipment standardization, high upfront capital investments for new facilities, and disputes with labor unions. Some railroads worked in a consortium together on piggyback standardization and contracts, while several others pursued more of a container-style approach. Both of these actually remain in use today. However, the container system later ended up being the preferred rail mode for international commerce because it could be put on ships too. That'd be as opposed to domestic commerce, where you're mostly thinking about rail and truck exchanges. Initial experiments with also simply putting full truck trailers onto ships, as Rachel said, did not prove economically competitive with stackable containers. The compromise method used for more perishables is a shipping container that can be quickly converted onshore to a wheeled trailer trucked on the highway. Over the course of the 1960s, major companies like GE or Kodak revised their shipment schedules to fill up containers with products for staggered movements, as I said, rather than sending a continuous stream of smaller cargo that required more handling in rail yards and seaports. Less rail yard handling also increased shipment speeds overland, as was happening at the same time in seaports. On the other hand, the railroads still generally ran containers in slow trains with other kinds of freights, so even if they weren't being handled, they still spent more time sitting around than necessary until later periods, and that was a challenge that also had to be overcome. By the late 1960s, with the experimental phase basically out of the way in the United States, although U.S. railroads were still largely actively resisting container traffic anyway, European railroads, operating under a very different regulatory environment going back to the 1920s, became very enthusiastic adopters of ship-rail container traffic, sort of proving how this could work. U.S. railroads instead mostly conceded ship container traffic to long-haul truckers for many years, to their great detriment. This finally brings us to the last chapter that we want to talk about in part 1 on the Vietnam War, because not only was this something that I really didn't know anything about, but I think it is hugely important to understanding not only the process of containerization, but the future implications. And as always, we think it's critically important to understand the role that the sort of U.S. military defense industrial complex plays in the industry side of things, and that this war on the far side of the world has profound implications for the entire structure of the global economy afterwards. So the chapter 8, before the Vietnam chapter, mentions the U.S. Army initially did some test shipping with container contracts to support the 250,000 troops stationed in West Germany. So this could have been sort of a little role that the U.S. military could have played in this process. But where things really take off is the vast expansion into a more serious program of containerization for military purposes as the Vietnam War grows in scope. And I think that you're going to find, if you haven't already familiarized yourself with this topic or read this book, that you are going to be surprised by the way in which containerization itself contributes to and enables the war effort in a way that may not have been possible otherwise. And that is a horrifying thing to think about for something that seems relatively mundane and boring. In early 1965, the U.S. began rapidly scaling up its military presence in South Vietnam. At the time, it was a country with one deepwater port 45 miles upriver from the coast in Saigon, and supposedly the operation was intended to only last for 1 year. This meant that on paper, it didn't make much sense to spend a lot on long-term capital improvements to transportation networks. Yet, the military would require enormous volumes of supplies be rapidly and cost-effectively imported into South Vietnam via chartered merchant ships. Initially, neither objective was being met. Ships would arrive from California and park offshore in deep water, miles out from the many shallow coastal harbors, while transfer barges went out to tediously unload them with ropes to lower cargo over the side, weather permitting. Sometimes there were so many idle ships waiting to unload that they were redirected to idle in the Philippines instead. The inland port of Saigon had just 10 ship berths and no mechanical equipment or way to notify a recipient that a shipment had arrived. Theft was rampant and intimately connected to the South Vietnamese military, which was, of course, very famously quite corrupt. The U.S. military and political leaders decided after some debate to set up a brand new deepwater port entirely under U.S. military control at Cam Ranh Bay. They set up a rudimentary deepwater port with temporary equipment by December 1965, at which point it was starting to become clear that U.S. military operations were only going to grow, not wind down. But of course, this only works if you can get the materials in and out when you need them. They also finally forced the South Vietnamese government and military to allow the creation of a new U.S. military seaport outside of Saigon, constructed by a specialist company that dealt with weird small ports in Alaska, which was comparable enough to the problem at hand. The U.S. Army was placed in supreme control of all materiel shipments into Vietnam, regardless of branch being supplied. This also helped because before that, every branch was trying to supply themselves, and it was just chaos and pandemonium on top of the other chaos and pandemonium. The U.S. Army's officers also ordered that all shipments be unified going out of the U.S. so that everything on board a single ship was bound for one specific point in Vietnam, even if it was going to have to do that offshore idling thing that we talked about. They also then recommended that a similar process be followed with the cargo within a ship, putting it into some type of box or container that was all going to the same place or military unit or whatever. Initially, they had in mind those 5-ton smaller metal Connex boxes, which had been used for military supply for a while. Again, we talked about the West German forces. But these were sent out with sort of jumbled up contents, and they were very small, so they didn't hold very much. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, coming from the private sector, stepped in to overrule this decision and pointed out that the private sector had recently pivoted toward and was rapidly embracing the much larger but now standardized transoceanic shipping containers, which Rachel talked about the standardization process of. McLean, the modern container pioneer and still the head of Sealand at the time, and I mean McLean the person in this case, was one of the private sector leaders brought in to provide advice to the military, and when he saw footage of the chaotic docks and barges in Vietnam, he began pursuing the goal of winning a contract to provide container service. He and 2 other employees flew to France and then Vietnam to see the various port and harbor facilities in person at several locations, and he got the backing of the ILA union leadership that also was touring the same facilities by coincidence to provide similar advice. McLean lobbied heavily in an environment where the military logistics officers knew they had to do something but had no experience with the new technology, and eventually Sealand secured contracts for trucking services at the port of Saigon, container shipping to the U.S. base at Okinawa to demonstrate the technology and its efficiencies, and then finally, direct service container shipping from the U.S. West Coast to Vietnam directly once a facility could be built in Vietnam to receive the container ships and handle their contents. The logisticians in Vietnam itself bitterly resisted the plan and delayed it as long as possible. Sealand therefore ended up building a container port in the Philippines at a U.S. Navy base as a proof of concept. Sealand finally offered to build the necessary terminals and cranes in South Vietnam themselves at their own cost. The proposed contract was $70 million on a fixed bid basis, with all liability except enemy attack falling to the company. They were given approval in the fall of 1966 and retrofitted the temporary facilities at Cam Ranh Bay that the U.S. military had erected the year before. They also brought a punch card computer to help run the port and keep track of containers out for local delivery. It was up and running in 1967. The contract also guaranteed minimum numbers of containers would be shipped by the U.S. military on various Pacific sea routes Sealand would operate to support the war effort. Matson, Sealand's peer company, was also eventually awarded a contract to help provide container service to Vietnam as well. The Army also guaranteed Sealand that all cargo that could be put in containers would be put in containers if they were coming out of the container ports in Seattle or Oakland. That's going to have pretty significant implications on both of those ports that we're going to talk about in Part 2. Excluding fuel shipments, which did not go by container, about 40% of all military cargo in 1968 went by container instead of break bulk. The lost, stolen, or damaged cargo problem mostly disappeared. The savings were enormous. Eventually, the Army renegotiated with Sealand to allow more of their rivals to use Sealand-built and controlled container ports in Vietnam so that traffic could be increased even more. The military also handed down the 3 Cs directive to all teams preparing shipments from the U.S. to Vietnam. 1 container, 1 customer, 1 commodity. So they would reorganize their pre-Sealand methodologies for packing and bundling shipments into the new system that Sealand wanted. The Army itself also began purchasing modern 20-foot containers directly for the first time in 1968. Army engineers began preparing plans for how to erect temporary container ports anywhere in the world at a moment's notice so that the logistical snarls of 1965 would never be repeated if the U.S. military decided to intervene somewhere else. McLean's lobbying for containerization of the war effort inadvertently made possible the massive escalation in Vietnam after 1965 and made it possible to do it anywhere, anytime. Levinson explicitly argues that waging this war on the far side of the world was only sustainable for as long as it was because of containerization of the war's supply chain across the Pacific, led by Sealand. DoD contracts delivered $450 million in revenues to Sealand between 1967 and 1973. But their build-out of trans-Pacific shipping to supply the U.S. military in Vietnam, Philippines, and Okinawa, plus soon to include other nearby U.S. bases in places like South Korea, also created big opportunities for civilian shipping. Sealand, following the lead of rival or peer Matson, decided to start shipping Japanese industrial goods back to the United States in the empty containers returning from U.S. military supply runs. Japan had already started building their own container ports based on U.S. standards in 1967, just as Sealand was setting up operations in Vietnam. Japanese companies also began signing agreements with the container port in Oakland to do their own shipping independently of the 2 U.S. companies. By the end of 1967, the era of Japanese exports to the U.S. was already well in swing via containerization after a growing volume of imports earlier in the break bulk era. The next year, there were already millions of Japanese TVs being sold in the United States. It nearly doubled again in the year after that. And I didn't really get into it in the notes too much, but the huge revenues that were being guaranteed by the U.S. military to Sealand eventually allows effectively a $1 billion sale of the company not too long after this setup period. And we'll talk a little bit more about the things that happen after this. And that's $1 billion in the money of the time, if you add up the various aspects of that deal. And it just goes to show you how inextricably linked this is. Now, before we take this episode to a close, Rachel, I wanted to pause here and talk specifically with you about this Vietnam aspect, because I focused on that particular chapter, but I just found this to be a mind-blowing chapter, that this war effort and the escalation specifically, from the military advisors phase into the, response phase at the end of 1964, early 1965, and then the significant increase up to 68 and the Tet Offensive period, is arguably only possible through this containerization effort and the port construction. And then on top of that, the result of all of this, the detritus left in the wake of this war, is an infrastructure set up all over that side of the Pacific Ocean to be able to send cargo back toward the United States for the first time from places that traditionally really wouldn't have sent that much cargo. And that's going to set up these trans-Pacific supply chains that we all are familiar with today.
Yeah, that's absolutely shocking. And it kind of reminds me of our bat guano episode where Germany didn't have the chemicals needed to create their explosives without the synthetic chemicals being readily available, and they were able to continue their war efforts due to a technological advancement, and we were able to continue and escalate our war efforts due to an infrastructure innovation and advancement. So there's kind of these huge paradigm shifts that have these unintended consequences and the parallels between World War One and Vietnam. It's just kind of interesting and kind of jumped out at me.
As I hinted at in my roadmap for this earlier, we'll leave things off here to end part one now that we have the seeds firmly planted for a range of upcoming themes in our next part, focusing on the domestic side of the situation in the late 1960s and the transition through the 1970s toward global containerization and globe bestriding supply chains with all the benefits and enormous challenges associated. But Rachel, what are some of the things that you want listeners to take away from part one that you think are going to be really important to keep holding on to and understanding as we move into part two?
So one major theme is the dying off of old ports as new ports come and are able to modernize and able to kind of build up from scratch. Basically, they don't have to retrofit anything. They can just kind of set themselves up as a rival, as a modern rival to these old ports. And so you kind of see winners and losers emerging. So I think that's a big theme to remember. And also just how big transoceanic shipping becomes. It's made possible by these innovations and standardization. So that's something to really keep in mind as we go into next week.
Right. It's not just that this is some sort of a tweak or slight innovation to the process that makes things a little bit more efficient. It's the difference between having almost no international shipping at a very high, expensive rate and time-consuming process to suddenly having enormous volumes of shipping going across not only international borders, but across oceans. And this process of reorganizing corporate operations, corporate structures, and eventually corporate locations in physical space because of this breakthrough. I think our perspective is that a lot of this has been pretty bad for the planet and for society and the economy. But we've got to understand how it happened and the way that it worked, regardless of even if we can't turn back the clock on it. It's important to understand how that happened and sort of the way that it reshaped people's understandings of time and space in the world as well, which is profoundly important for shifts in capitalism itself that come out of the 1970s, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah, as was pointed out by Levinson in the first chapter, consumer goods goes down, which makes people happy, but at the same time, labor is getting depressed. The economy is kind of on this downward shift in competition for wages and resources and so forth. And so there's definitely a lot of good that happens and also a lot of bad that happens, especially as you point out, environmentally and labor wise. There's all these really bad unintended consequences, I think.
Well, a really long episode this week, obviously. We had a really short episode recently, and I just wanted to make sure that we at least got through the Vietnam era in part one, because I think that's so profoundly fundamental to understanding this story, not only where this first half of it culminates, but also where things go after that. It's directly, physically, geographically related to that story. Rachel, thank you so much for joining me to talk about part one of the Levinson book on containerization.
Thanks for having me, and I'm looking forward to next week's discussion as well.